Daniel Brin, one of the project stakeholder team members representing Hyde County. Happy to have all y'all here and see the interest that this project develops and see everybody's love for Lake Mattamuskeet. And we'll go ahead and get started on our public meeting tonight. And once again, thank you. And I'll turn it over to Allison.
All right. Good evening, everybody. I have met some of you, but I haven't met a lot of you. So thank you all for coming. My name is Allison Flynn. I work for the North Carolina Coastal Federation out of our Northeast office in Wanchese as their coastal advocate. And just real quick before we get started, for all the virtual attendees, I want to make sure, can you guys hear okay? Somebody just raise a hand or say hello.
Hi, I hear you fine.
Great, thank you guys. So just a couple housekeeping things before we get started. This meeting is going to be recorded and it is going to be available on our website, including all the presentations you see tonight. The question and comment period. So we have, including my presentation, we have 3 other presentations. So we are going to hold questions for after everybody's had their presentation, been able to go through their presentation. Part of that is so people attending in public can also be heard by those joining virtually. So for all questions and comments that are here in this room, we just ask that you speak into that microphone there, and that way everybody tuning in virtually can also hear your questions or comments and be a part of the discussion. For those of you that are tuned in virtually, your mics will be muted throughout, but we'll do our best to keep on top of the chat feature. So I ask any questions or comments throughout the meeting tonight, please use the chat feature. And if we do run out of time, I'll be sure to save a little bit of time after the meeting to make sure I get your contact information so that we can make sure everybody's questions are answered while also being considerate of everyone's time this evening. That being said, my email address is Allison with a Y, so ALYSONF@nccoast.org. So just to give an overview of the discussion tonight, we're going to kick off by giving kind of an overview of the watershed restoration plan. It's been a year since we had a public meeting, so kind of bringing everybody back up to speed of the happenings that have occurred, and also kind of tell the story of how this process started so that we're all on the same page. I know a lot of you have attended many meetings in the past, but there might be some new people in the room tonight as well. So we just want to make sure everyone is provided the context for kind of the discussion for the night. We're then going to hear from Alessa from Geosyntech. She is our the engineering firm that we have hired to discuss the active water management plans and modeling for the lake. We also have Tom Roberts here with us tonight from the UNC School of Government Environmental Finance Center to discuss some of the long-term funding strategies. And then we have Wendy Stanton from U.S. Fish and Wildlife join virtually, who is going to be giving kind of an update of the carp removal efforts in the lake before we talk about next steps and kind of where we're at today and where we're kind of looking into the future before we open up for discussion and questions. So again, my name is Allison Flynn, and I am the coastal advocate with the North Carolina Coastal Federation. And I apologize while I admit, I want to make sure that all the virtual attendees are able to be admitted. So you might see me pop over to the screen every once in a while. Our story kind of begins with submerged aquatic vegetation in the lake. Back in 1989, as you'll see through this graph, I know a lot of you have probably seen this graphic before, and you'll probably see it again tonight. But the amount of coverage of submerged aquatic vegetation in the lake, as you can see, started to become kind of alarming for some people as they started to notice that it was decreasing throughout the lake. You can see in 1989, there was this hot spot of blue where there wasn't much submerged aquatic vegetation, and that is a deeper part of the lake. But then we saw a little bit of recovery before a portion of the lake hitting people. A portion of the lake started to kind of die off as far as the submerged aquatic vegetation until we get to about 2016, where we almost see a near complete fall of all submerged aquatic vegetation in the lake. Our story tonight is really going to start around 2016 because that's when the lake was actually placed on the state's 303D list of impaired waters. At that time, the two main criteria that were seen to be exceedingly high and kind of got the lake on this list were the pH and the chlorophyll A. So pH typically you want it to be more neutral. That's considered a healthier lake, but we were starting to see levels closer towards 11. So the typical range that you'd like to see between 6 and 9, we started to see in the more basic area around the 11 in some of the water samples. And then chlorophyll A is kind of a good indicator for algal blooms within the lake. And so we started to see more of a hypertrophic and eutrophic lake system. And actually in 2020, the turbidity levels in the lake were also classified as exceedingly high on this 303D list of the state's impaired waters. So what happened next? In just a year later, it was recognized that something needed to happen. And so a partnership was formed between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission and Hyde County, and the North Carolina Coastal Federation. Part of that process was compiling a stakeholder team. Now this team has changed over the years, but this is how the team currently stands. And it includes a broad range of perspectives and residential property owners throughout the watershed. And in 2018, through stakeholder input and with the partners working together, a draft of a watershed restoration plan was put together with goals of trying to get the lake back to a healthy state. Just a couple months later, so that was actually in December that final draft was presented to the public just down the road in Martell's. And in 2019, early 2019, the plan was approved by the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. So what did the plan do? It really came down to 3 main primary goals. One was to protect the way of life in Hyde County. So this was trying to maintain the existing land uses while also enhancing and maintaining the health of the lake's natural resources, including waterfowl and wildlife. The second goal was to actively manage the lake water level. So ultimately, this aimed to minimize flooding within the watershed that impacted residential businesses and farming properties around the lake. The third goal of the plan was to restore water quality. So the most, probably the biggest goal would to be ultimately to get the lake off of the 303D list of impaired waters. So recognizing that these are pretty big goals for a pretty big and beautiful lake, it's important to identify how are we going to do this. So part of that plan and working with the stakeholder team, the priority actions of the watershed restoration plan were identified, and they basically came down to 3 primary priority actions. The first one, if I can move this for you guys, sorry, there we go. The first one was to create a formal body that provides managing authority for active water management within the lake, and in close coordination with the refuge. But it should be noted that Fish and Wildlife would be excluded as a formal body of this since they cannot cede management authority. The second priority action that was identified was to perform a hydrologic study of the watershed, which has actually been completed to date. The third would be was to design engineered plans for active water management within the watershed, looking at infrastructure improvements, additional outlet evaluation, and potential sheet flow sites. And this has been done as well. So looking forward into 2019 to 2021, we had the watershed restoration plan accepted and approved. And so around 2019 forward, we've kind of entered this implementation phase. So the biggest priority immediately was we've identified our goals, we've identified our priority actions. But the next step is, how are we going to pay for any identified projects or anything to achieve our goals and our priority actions? So there was time spent on securing funding to implement the priority management actions. 3 funding sources were looked at and secured, including the National Science Foundation, the General Assembly, and the North Carolina Land and Water Fund. ECU actually had the National Science Foundation grant, which they used, led by a team of faculty at ECU and engineering students. Dr. Randall Etheridge kind of led the efforts there. And they looked at preliminary engineering and cost analyses for 3 kind of conceptual plans for the lake. And they looked at these conceptual plans and tried to come up with kind of a really good understanding of what something might cost, but just kind of setting the groundwork for moving forward. So with the funding secured from the General Assembly and the Land and Water Fund, we were able to hire Geosyntech and Coastal Protection Engineering to create a watershed model and explore different options for moving water within the watershed and water management within the lake. Sorry. All right, so we're still in the implementation phase of the watershed restoration plan. Okay, sorry. So Geosyntech has looked at kind of 9 different options at this time to evaluate the effectiveness and cost of moving water within the lake. From those 9 options, 2 were really selected by the stakeholder team as kind of priority projects that were identified by the stakeholder team and ultimately presented to the Hyde County Board of Commissioners. Those 2, at the time, the 2 projects identified were looking at different sheet flow sites around the watershed and also gravity drainage to the drainage districts. But when these plans were presented to the Board of Commissioners, 2 main important questions came up. The first one being, what improvements could actually be made to Outfall Canal? And the second one is, well, all these projects sound great and have a lot of benefit. What kind of funding strategies exist? Because they do seem like very expensive endeavors. So what exists that could help kind of fund these projects moving forward? So at that time, we kind of put a pause on the 2 projects that were identified, and we started exploring these 2 new questions. So for the past 9 months, this is the 2 questions that we've really been examining. In early 2022, so earlier this year, we received a direct appropriation to Hyde County from the state to look at these questions and further examine the watershed restoration plan and kind of the priority projects that were identified.
It stopped.
If everybody could please mute themselves. Okay.
What happened?
It's my volume stopped.
not appropriate. All right. Get us started. So, I do see a chat. I'm just gonna check that y'all can still hear us, right? Everyone on the line? Okay. Thanks for joining us today. Again, I'm Alessa Bradswell. I'm with Geosyntech, and I've been managing the engineering scope of this project over the past year and a half now. And so really excited to talk to y'all today about what we've done since the last public meeting update. So we're going to talk a little bit about the overview of the active water management project, which was kind of one of those first actions that were identified in the watershed restoration plan. A quick overview of those goals and objectives and where we ended up as a part of that project. And then, as Allison discussed, we wrapped up that first scope of work and still had some questions about how what improvements could be made to Outfall Canal to improve drainage from the lake and water management within the lake. And so that's where we've been spending some of our time over the past 9 months or so, and then where we're headed next and what our plans are for that. So the active water management study had a few overarching goals. The first was that we really wanted to develop a model that accurately showed how water moved and was conveyed within the watershed and discharged from the lake as well. So we developed a 3D model to help show to help accurately predict lake water level within under two named storms, Hurricane Matthew and Joaquin. And what we found was that the model did really well in predicting lake water level under those scenarios. And so then it was important for us to establish existing conditions and how the lake responded to different design storms, so different storm events, and then how different engineering alternatives would affect the management of that water. Essentially, we were looking at trying to improve lake drawdown after a storm event, but also looking at options that would allow you to have flexibility to manage water on a day-to-day basis as well. And then we kind of screened a bunch of alternatives and as we discussed, progressed to permit level plans. And so the April 2021 public meeting, we were kind of at the phase where we had evaluated a lot of engineering alternatives and were in the screening process. And so I'm going to go from there and recap what we've done since then. So as a reminder, we looked at a lot of different options, some that were focused on pumping and various pumping rates. We also looked at the sheet flow sites, which I'll talk a little bit more about. We did look at dredging the existing canals and optimizing the outlet structures. After the screening analysis, we ultimately moved forward with doing additional simulations for the sheet flow sites and the gravity drain canals to the drainage district. So the sheet flow sites, that is what you see to the left here. The concept there is that water would be diverted or pumped from the lake watershed and basically sheet flowed over different properties to create like a wetland that would allow for treatment of the water and then discharge and management of the water outside the lake watershed. So there would be benefit there in creating additional storage capacity and also water quality benefit as well. The gravity drain canals concept was that since in general the private drainage districts surrounding the lake to the north of the lake have managed water lower than the lake water level, that we would create water control structures that would allow for movement of water between the lake and these drainage districts, and then that would be controlled and optimized such that we can manage lake water levels and then pump the additional water to various places, again outside of the lake watershed. And so we did as I said, this design storm screening, which allowed us to compare how each of the options were effective, how quickly they drew down the lake, and what the costs were associated with, capital costs associated with these projects. And so what we saw was that the gravity drain canals were more effective, primarily because the sheet flow sites were kind of a distributed infrastructure with multiple pump stations, multiple restorations, whereas the gravity drain canals were slightly more, 3 sites versus 6. That being said, all of them did have benefit and helped improve drawdown of the lake. Ultimately, it was decided to progress the gravity drain canals alternative to permit level plans. And that was, with input from stakeholders and Hyde County as well. So that's was our next step. And what we were doing there was we looked at improving the canals, siting pump stations, preliminary sizing of water control structures that again would be able to control movement of water between the lake watershed and these other areas to the north. And as I said, that was we were really excited about that option, and we also thought the sheet flow sites was another great option as well. In fact, we are moving forward, or the Coastal Federation is moving forward with a pilot scale project to construct one of those or to prepare engineering and design for one of those proposed sheet flow sites. But still, at the end of the active water management evaluation, we knew that there was interest from stakeholders, interest from Hyde County in evaluating options and costs to dredge Outfall Canal. So we said, okay, we've got some great options. We're going to also look at Outfall Canal more closely and see what we can do there. And so that kind of led to this work that we've been doing in 2022. The first step was developing a more, collecting topographic and bathymetric data for Outfall Canal so we could better estimate what the actual quantities of removal would be needed for various dredge cross sections. We also considered we're also looking at additional model simulations to help understand what areas of the watershed will be impacted by each action. Will some areas be benefited more from certain actions compared to others? Another thing that we've been looking at is characterizing Outfall Canal sediment and making sure that there's no contaminants in there that would preclude us being able to use the dredged material in a certain way. So looking at reuse options for that. And then we also looked at developing cost estimates as well for dredging Outfall Canal. So the first step, as I said, was getting more accurate data within the canal area, Outfall Canal specifically. And so that was conducted earlier this year, and we were able to incorporate it into our model and as well as some of our quantity estimates. You can see the result of the bathymetric data here. And so what you can see is these kind of yellow to green areas. Yellow represents 1 to 2 feet deep. Green is 2 to 5 feet deep. So you can see up closer to the lake that, we're seeing an average of 3 to 4 feet deep and between 5 to 6 feet deep closer to the sound, with one area slightly deeper here as well. We, like I said, put that in the model. Our model is still predicting lake water level very well, both for our storm events that we had already looked at, as well as periods of time where the lake was, drainage from the lake was more favorable. So what you're seeing here is an example of a dredge cross section that we considered. And so the blue line represents the water level, kind of corollary to this water level over here. And then the red line represents, is a representative cross section for the existing grade. So basically that's where the existing canal is. The purple is what the supposed original design cross section was according to historical records, with a 60-foot bottom width and 10 feet deep, approximately 1-to-1 side slope. And so if you can imagine, if you see how this is coming out until where it's meeting the red existing grade, and then you look over at this picture, that original design cross section would encroach into the current banks that are there, which would cause a lot of disturbance that would not be ecologically desired. So we ultimately ended up looking at a design cross section that was just as deep, 10 feet deep, but slightly shallower on the bottom. And so you can see the material that was removed. And of course, it'll vary exactly where you are in the outfall along the canal, but you can kind of see this representation of the material that was removed and how much more cross section there would be. And so for that amount, or for that cross section, it's approximately 330,000 cubic yards of material. So for kind of a visual perspective, that's across approximately 6 inches of sediment across around 400 acres of land. So it's a lot of material that would need to be removed and managed. Another thing that we did is looked at the sediment in Outfall Canal. So the purpose of that was to look at reuse and management options for the dredged material. As we said, it's a lot of material. We got to find a place for it to go. So Daniel helped us with some boat access, and we got on the water and took sediment cores, as you can see in these pictures here, from 3 locations along the canal. And we did even get to see a little alligator, which was exciting for me. We evaluated each of these sediment samples for contaminants that might be concerning from a reuse perspective. So NCTEQ has preliminary, they have guidelines of how high certain contaminants can be and also be reused for fill material or other applications. And so our initial evaluation did indicate that there was no unacceptable risk for these within these sediment samples, which is good. It means we have a lot of management options. The agronomic analysis, though, did indicate that the salt content may be limiting for ag field application as an amendment to that. So we looked at a few different sediment management options in Outfall Canal. As I said, salt content, the salinity was quite high. Therefore, there would certainly need to be analysis done on any receiving fill were we to use it as a soil amendment. Other considerations it would be thin layer placement for marsh restoration, which is we just heard that the CRC is exploring that potentially as a use in North Carolina. It's been used in other areas as well. And we do think that that could be a good option, and particularly given some of the salt content. And then also fill material as well. And so there are pros and cons to each of these, but certainly nothing was excluded from our characterization analysis. And I think that was a good finding there. So we developed these cost estimates, and basically we found that it was going to be fairly cost prohibitive to dredge the canal exactly as proposed. So we did look at that cost estimate for 10 feet depth, but are currently under the process of considering other other potential cross sections. So as you can see here, you know, there's a southeast part of the canal that has deeper areas. Perhaps we match that depth there. We're also looking at evaluating hot spots. So you can see that there are some areas, you know, here and then down here by the sound, and trying to optimize the dredging such that there's better hydraulic connectivity. So that's where we're at now. That was something that we heard from stakeholders and are continuing that process. So kind of our next steps, as I mentioned early on, we're looking at evaluating what areas of the watershed are going to benefit from these options so that we could potentially propose a tiered fee structure that is a little bit more equitable. And then we're looking at these alternative dredging cross sections to be able to directly compare alternatives, both this outfall canal as well as directly compare to the previous engineered alternatives that we had looked at the end of phase 1. So the gravity drain canals and the sheet flow site. We will have an interagency permitting meeting down the road to discuss in more detail the permit needs for both of these proposed projects. And we're having ongoing discussions on construction methods so that we can refine cost estimates and see where there might be some cost savings as well. So for that, we do hope to have a recommendation for a cross section or potential dredge design by the end of 2022. So moving forward with that. A schedule update. As you know, we're really kind of in a modeling phase right now. We are going out to collect a few more sediment samples along the canal next week to look at salinity in a few different places. And then we'll be continuing to have some stakeholder meetings through October and December. And I think the next public meeting is slated for January. So with that, I will take any questions. Or not. We're gonna do questions at the end. Okay.
Yeah, for those of you that can't see, our TV turned off mid, so that's why there's some shuffling around, but all the Zoom attendees can still see. They just can't see us presenting, but they can see our presentation just fine.
Good evening. My name is Tom Roberts, and I'm Senior Business Analyst at the University of North Carolina Environmental Finance Center. And I'm happy to be here tonight. I feel like a rookie, right? Because you've seen most everybody else, I think. And first time for me at a public meeting here. I've been to stakeholders meeting once before, but I'm happy to be here tonight and happy to present. A little bit about the Environmental Finance Center. We like to remind people we're not funders, because that's usually the first question we get asked because it's Environmental Finance Center. Typically what we do is help units or organizations identify funding sources, and we might help them apply for those funding sources. And we do a bunch of research, and we usually revolve around drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater. So we will dabble in some other things once in a while. We get into energy from time to time, but mostly it's the water field right now. We're based in the School of Government. So if you're an elected official, you've taken classes with the School of Government. We're in that same building. And most of our staff, all of our staff except me, is located in Chapel Hill. I'm a Carteret County resident. So we're happy to be here tonight. So this kind of frames the request to us from the Coastal Federation for this project. As you've heard, there's need for additional infrastructure, both upfront capital costs, but really what we focused on was the long-term operations and maintenance costs and how they were going to be funded. funded. Some of the funding options that were currently being considered probably weren't sufficient or unavailable. And so the key question that we were asked to do some research on and give some ideas on was how can the infrastructure, whatever it ends up being, how can that be sustainably financed over the entire lifetime of the project? So that was our task. And so that's how we approached it. So we did it by doing, we did identification of funding models for O&M. We did a bunch of research. We're a small group at the Environmental Finance Center, but we staff up with students, and we're right there on campus. So we've got a pretty good pool of students that we can draw from. And we're one of the, we attract students, they find us, they want to work for the Environmental Finance Center. And then we have evaluated some of the ideas for what is being looked at here for Mattamuskeet. So I'll give you a little bit of our research strategy. So we reviewed literature. There's the EPA has an Environmental Finance Advisory Board. In case you want to wow your friends and neighbors, it's called EFAB because there's an acronym for everything. And so we looked at some of their work. We did a bunch of peer reviewed. We looked at a bunch of peer reviewed articles. We did talk to some subject matter experts. So we talked to some people that are in the nonprofit world, including those that you see there, Nature Conservancy and the National Research Foundation of Wisconsin. And then we talked to some other people within the state that we thought might have some interest in helping us and also might have some resources that we could point to. And everybody was really interested in helping us with this. So it was a fun project to work on. And then when the way the world runs now, we did a web scour, right? All the information is out there on the web somewhere. You just have to do that. And so we had some students doing a bunch of that, and then project managers that were involved in this work. So we really boil it down to two sort of vehicles for funding, and I'm going to talk about them tonight. And they're endowment and trust, and you're going to see that they're very similar, with one significant difference, and you'll catch on to that right away. Both require an initial source of funding. So like a principal investment, and then you'll see how it works after that. So we'll start with an endowment. So an endowment fund is funded by a principal investment or investments over time. That principal investment never goes away. So it's the way the endowment is written. The principal would be protected. It couldn't be spent through the lifetime of the endowment. The interest-bearing account that comes from the endowment funding, the interest would be used think of it as an annuity to pay for the ongoing O&M. And so remember, we were charged to look at O&M expense over the lifetime of the project, not necessarily the initial investment for the project. There are lots of opportunities. I think when you get further along in identifying that, there's lots of opportunities for some help on some of that initial capital. It's the O&M that's sort of the sticking point that we were asked to look at. There is a specific governance structure that's built into endowments, and this is sort of our disclaimer. A legal counsel should be involved to ensure the endowment is working as intended and basically written as the stakeholders want it to be written. But an endowment protects the investment over the life of the endowment. So here's a graphic representation of that. So we've let the big blue bar we established as a gift. That gift could come from private donations, or it could come from an appropriations from both state or the federal level. but it's a block of money and there's no reason that you couldn't keep adding to that if you wanted to. And then that block of money would be invested and managed by a professional investment person, a company. And then the endowment would throw off some interest, and that would be used for the ongoing funding of the needs of the O&M. The way we've done that in that pie chart there is you could look at it as it could be part of the O&M. You could, if you had a big enough endowment, you could potentially do all the O&M. But in this representation, we showed it as the endowment funds piece, maybe, excuse me, an annual campaign funds a piece. Maybe there's other grant sources, funds a piece, and maybe there's a fee for service. And I think that's just something that you gotta, all those and maybe more are possibilities in the future. But we were talking about the endowment. One of the things that we found in our research was that bigger endowments have a bigger return, not just the volume, but percentage return. So if a piece of guidance that I would give would be to ask for as much as you can in the beginning, right? It's easier to ask for a lot and get kind of whittled down if that's the case, either through allocation or appropriations or other forces or sources. But smaller endowments typically don't have as good a return as some of the bigger endowments. So here's a little representation of how the endowment might work. A $10 million investment with a 5% return would throw off $500,000 a year of available funding for O&M. And there's considerations when you're doing this. Again, you can see the ending balance remains the same, so the principal remains protected if you decide on an endowment or decisions made on endowment. The other thing is there can be continuous contributions to an endowment. So maybe it starts off as 10 million, maybe in a out year, another appropriation is given to the endowment, or maybe there's a other funding source that's identified that can go into the endowment. And so that could grow over time. And of course, as that grows, the interest earned would grow too, kind of thing. It's the way we looked at it was O&M would remain constant. I think as you start flushing out, excuse me, more of the what you're going to do, clearly things change over a 20-year cycle or longer. Inflation, power costs, that kind of thing. So it's only as good as the inputs into the model to see if this would fund the O&M expenses. Again, in a true endowment, $10 million in this example is never recovered by the organization, stays in the endowment. There's ways of doing that. You can set up what's called a quasi endowment that allows some of that principal to be used if there's an emergency or whatever, however that's written up. Again, a lawyer who's versed in endowments and building and writing those up and developing them can guide you with that. So a trust is, think of an endowment, but you can spend the principal. That's the major difference. So both the principal and interest can be spent out over the project's lifetime. At the end of the trust life, there is virtually no money left in the trust. So you would have to go back and ask for more money, or there would have to be another funding source. And it also, I think it gives, there might be a little bit more risk in this because you're paying that, you're taking some of that trust money over the period of time. There is one substantial benefit to it though, and I'll show you that in a minute. So this is basically how a trust would work graphically, or graphically. In year one, you would fund it with a principal amount. And it would throw off interest, and then the O&M costs would go out to pay for the cost to operate the system. And then over a period of time, you would still use the interest. The interest would of course get smaller because your principal, you would also be using some of the principal. And at the end of the life of the trust, there would be virtually no money left. That's what's represented here. So there's the one big difference, right? Over the way this trust is set up, you would only need $6.25 million to basically get the same amount of withdrawals over the 20-year period that the $10 million of the endowment would give you. But at the end of 20 years, you would have virtually no money. You would have an ending balance of about $50,000 in the trust. So it's just a different way of approaching things. I think you just got to decide which one you feel more comfortable with. Tom's opinion would, I would lean towards endowment because I like the idea of having the principal at the end and be able to grow on that. Your expenses aren't going to go away at the end of that 20 years. So that will give you some cushion there. The biggest difference is that endowment, the trust, you need less of a principal in the beginning. So there's $6.25 million. You only end up with 50,000 at the end of that. So here's a comparison of the two. They both require a principal investment. The trust would be less upfront. The endowment would be more. You can always add to these, so it's not a one and done kind of thing. And there can be, you can have multiple trusts and multiple endowments, and you could have quasi endowments where that would be separate from like a base endowment where you would have a principal that went in, but it would allow you to spend some of that capital under very specific certain circumstances, depending on how the endowment is written. Returns on the endowment would be in perpetuity, easy for me to say, right? A trust, at the end of the trust, that's it. There's no more returns. The principal is virtually paid out. So I'm going to give you just two examples of one of an endowment and one of a trust. This one is the Great Lakes Protection Fund. As you can see, that was formed in 1989 between 7 states. It's funded by state appropriations, no ongoing deposits or revenue streams, and it's used to fund projects in the Great Lakes. And because it's multiple states, they've got it set up so that 2/3 of it is sort of general use between over the 7 states, and then 1/3 is used just in 1/3 is split between the 7 states. But it was set up as an endowment, so the principal was one-time appropriation, and it just kind of throws off enough money to do what it needs to do. Trust. This is a little different kind of trust. This is the Inland Waterways Trust. This one is funded by revenues on the commercial waterway users. It's matched by funds by the U.S. Treasury, assuming that gets appropriated in general in the budget, in the federal budget. It has been over time. So it's a trust, and it's got federal fund matching. It's large, right? $220 million, $240 million. And it goes to construction and maintenance costs benefiting the waterways. And you can see in this little map here that it's basically the Mississippi Basin, and up in the Northwest, I guess that's the Columbia Basin. It looks like the Intercoastal Waterway also. So key takeaways, right? Interest-bearing account gives you sustainable long-term funding for O&M. We probably could have said options for federally funded O&M are worse than sparse, right? We rarely find federally funded O&M for what you're proposing here, sort of this private landowners and the federal government kind of working together on O&M. Direct appropriation offers a solution. The one thing I would say, and we talked about this at the last stakeholders meeting, is there's probably a pretty good opportunity right now with the federal government. There's a lot of opportunity for funding things coming out of Washington, D.C. We do a lot of work on the drinking water and wastewater side, as I said earlier, and that's what we're working on almost 24/7 is how to get that money out into the units that need that kind of funding. And then when you're thinking of capital, when you're thinking of significant capital projects, you probably should look outside the endowment or trust for that. That would be our recommendation, would be to look for funding on its own. So whether it's there's money for resiliency or flood mitigation or that kind of thing, that would be our recommendation, to look to one-time funding for that, for those kind of capital projects. So here's sort of the look forward future considerations. At some point, you're going to have to decide what's the best source for O&M for funding O&M costs for the lake. We've given you two examples. I think either one of those would work depending on which way you want to do it. How should your principal be funded? I think that's a discussion with the state and the federal government to see if they would be interested, if they could find the way to fund some of that from the principal, or maybe all the principal. You need to decide who's going to manage the endowment or the trust. There's professionals that do that kind of stuff, and return on investment, right, will vary. Sound like a Merrill Lynch commercial there, but that's the facts of the matter, right? So you have to have some flexibility in your O&M also. So you might have a year where your interest is more than your O&M, you bank that, and then kind of vice versa. And there's my contact information. We've also created a one-pager, I think it's back there on the table. It also has my contact information and kind of gives you the principal bullets on endowments and trusts. That's it. Thank you.
So our next presentation is going to be from Wendy Stanton, and she's actually going to be joining us virtually. So if you just give me a moment while I get her set up to share her screen. Wendy,
Hey,
can you hear-
Allison, I'm going to try and share my screen.
Okay.
It's okay. We'll see if the internet works well with that. And good evening, everybody. I'm going to turn my camera off, but I wanted just to say hello with the camera on.
Okay, Wendy, if you could start sharing, we'll make sure we can see you on our end.
Okay. Says you cannot start screen sharing while the other participant is sharing.
Okay, try now. Sorry about that.
Okay, that's no problem. Are you seeing my screen?
Nope.
What about now?
Nope.
Really? Let's try it again. Are you seeing it now?
Nope.
Okay.
I can pull up your PDF. I have that ready that I could scroll through if you would just be able to tell me when to move slides.
Okay, let me. Still not coming through.
Okay, we'll try that. That's okay.
Are you seeing it?
Nope.
Okay, we'll just use, oh, I know why, because I didn't hit share. Are you seeing it now?
We are, yep.
Okay, my bad. Okay, I'm going to give a brief overview for the technical working group update on the invasive common carp removal project. Allison has already done an excellent job providing the history of this entire process, the collaboration process. But I just want to start off by sharing the Mattamuskeet National Wildlife Refuge purpose, which is to protect and conserve migratory birds and other wildlife resources through the protection of wetlands. And this graphic has already been shown. And again, the darker color shows an absence of SAV or aquatic grasses in the lake. And in 2016, you could see pretty much the entire lake was void of submerged aquatic vegetation. In 2017, it was designated as not having any SAV in the lake. And that has continued to present. I do want to point out that during drought situations, when the water level is very low along the perimeter of the lake, like back in 2020, and also when SAV surveys were conducted this summer, sometimes we will see small patches of chara or muskgrass. That is an algae, but waterfowl do forage on that, and it is encouraging to see something green and rooted growing in the lake when sunlight can penetrate those sediments. The technical working group has used the 1980s Davis and Brinson conceptual model to understand SAV declines in the lake and to help identify and prioritize research and monitoring needs to inform SAV restoration. This year, the technical working group updated this model with more specific information unique to Mattamuskeet and to make it more user-friendly for the public to understand. And this is the results of updating that model. We've reported on this model and how we've used research and monitoring to answer various questions, but this is the updated model, conceptual model based on the Davis and Brinson 1980 version. Okay, carp removal. Some of the things I'm going to talk about were reported last year, but I wanted to show everything that's been completed to date. And the first thing is we've been able to complete all of the compliance documents, and this included an environmental assessment, compatibility determination, and other documents that were required to move forward with the carp removal project. The EA and the CD were open for public comments back in 2021. We completed a contaminant analysis for carp for human consumption. The results of that showed that it's healthy to eat carp. Carp in the lake are healthy to eat, and evidently they're quite tasty. So we want to just pass the word along that if you catch carp, they're good to eat. The reason why we did this contaminant analysis for carp was if the vendor, the person who was awarded the contract, is interested in pursuing human consumption markets, such as in the New York area or other areas in the country, he will have that information. He or she will have that information to provide to the marketplaces. The common carp barriers, which were the 2-inch spacings, flat bar barriers, you can see in the middle picture, were inserted at the tide gates back in March of 2021. So they've been in place for over a year now. These barriers are critically important at blocking new carp from entering the lake from the Pamlico Sound. And we think, and this is just professional opinion, that this is already having an impact on the carp population because it's blocking those new carp entering the sound. And the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission has conducted bluegill stocking in the lake last year and this year. And these are just some photos of the bluegill stocking. Wappa State Fish Hatchery is where the fish were reared, and the fingerlings were stocked along the southern perimeter of the lake. And those are the areas that have the highest concentration of carp spawning areas. And bluegill, why this is so important is bluegill hunt by sight and are very effective predators on carp eggs and larvae. And as the water quality improves in the lake, their ability to effectively prey on carp larvae and eggs will also improve. So this is a very important tool in really trying to target the small carp and the eggs. I want to give a shout out to North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission, the fisheries biologists. I have them listed at the bottom, Kevin Dockentorf, Katie, and others. They're the ones who actually did the stocking in the lake and just did an amazing job. This past year, we had the privilege of working with two amazing East Carolina University capstone teams. The first team was the deterrent team, and this team actually designed a deterrent device that could be used to scatter carp at the tie gates if and when only absolutely necessary. It was required to lift those carp barriers to flush debris at the tie gates to not impede drainage issues. And what they did, if you can see, I don't know if you see my cursor, the second picture from the left, there's a clear box right there. They designed this box with strobe lights and speakers that made piercing sounds. And they hoisted it down next to the tie gate, turned it on, and everything scattered. So it actually worked very well. And it was exciting too, because the hoist system they used was from the previous year's capstone project. So they got to use some of their former students' work to lower this thing in the water. The second team was the barrier and debris removal team. And this team actually designed and provided recommendations for the secondary carp barrier and provided recommendations for mechanical means to remove debris that could impede drainage concerns. So the next step for the carp removal, in accordance with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and federal contracting laws and policies, we're in the final stages of completing all contracting documentation. That's the language that goes into the contract that will go out to bid. Once we receive the funding from the Large Invasive Species Grant, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will seek bids for the contracting opportunity and award the contract to the qualified vendor. So hopefully that's coming up in the next few months. Okay, as we all know, communication is very important. And if you've been driving around the refuge, you probably recognize several of these signs. The first sign we installed was the water warning advisory sign, warning the public of harmful algal blooms that release cyanotoxins. The second sign was placed at the tie gates to explain the importance of those carp barriers in the SAV restoration efforts. It blocks that carp from coming into the lake. This third sign will be installed probably later in October. And this sign is going to be placed at the 5 culverts along Highway 94. And it's going to say, if you can't see the slide real well, it just states, it gives everyone a heads up that portions of the areas around the culverts may be temporarily blocked to remove invasive common carp from the lake and improve aquatic grasses in the lake. We want to give everyone a heads up that when the massive carp removal is ongoing, there's some of those culverts may be temporarily blocked. At the bottom of the sign, we have a link to the new project page, which is linked to the Mattamuskeet website. We just made this live yesterday. I'm gonna try and see if I can get on it. Hold on. Here it is. Can you see this on the screen?
We can, yep.
Okay. The technical working group with others, with Fish and Wildlife Service, and Sarah Toner pulled this together for us. This is going to provide up-to-date, current, accurate information about the SAV restoration in the lake and carp removal. And I invite you all to take a look at this. This is going to be updated as we get new information. It has a table of contents that you can click on to go to the various sections. It has the history of the lake, the importance of SAV. This right here is a carp removal conceptual model that shows preferred methods of removing common carp from lakes. Some of these methods we know have been successful historically at Lake Mattamuskeet with the efforts to remove massive amounts of carp back in the 40s and 50s. And other methods are are techniques that have proven successful at other locations across the country. And these are just preferred techniques. We also have this link to the Lake Mattamuskeet Watershed Restoration Plan on the Coastal Federation website. And one section that's a live section that I just want to point out is frequently asked questions. This is going to be updated very often as we answer or receive additional questions about the carp removal process and where we're at with that process. So really excited to have this live, and it's going to be a living document. Let's see if I can get out of it. Maybe not. Okay. So that's basically where we are right now, and I'm open for any questions, or unless you want questions at the very end.
Yep, we're gonna hold for questions. We just have one more thing to review, and then we're gonna open up the floor for questions and comments for all the presenters tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. All right, so just to kind of recap, we've kind of discussed tonight where we were starting in 2016, how we got to today. And I just want to provide a moment to kind of look into the future of where we're going and some major things that will be occurring in the next couple of months. First, we are going to continue working with the core stakeholder team and Geosyntec consultants. Our goal is to be able to compare the costs and benefits of doing work in Outfall Canal to the other solutions that were previously presented. So there's two other options being the sheet flow sites and also the gravity drain canals. The second item that is in the works right now that we're also progressing on is the selection of a firm to survey and design a sheet flow wetland on a private property on the northern portion of the lake. It is a private property, as I mentioned, and the work is anticipated to begin in the fall of 2022, so just around the corner, and last approximately 10 months. We did have a pre-bid meeting just last week. This is a picture from that meeting from different firms that are interested in applying for this project. Tomorrow is actually when the applications are due, and next week we're planning to select a firm in conjunction with Hyde County to progress with the survey and design portion of that project. And with that, I do want to open up the floor and provide as much time as possible for questions and comments. Again, for those of you attending virtually, we're going to do our best to make sure we get to everybody's questions, but if we do run out of time, I'll be sure to grab your contact information. And for everybody here in the room and also online, you can also see the watershed restoration plan and all the developments occurring if you go to nccoast.org/Lake Mattamuskeet. Additionally, you can also contact myself at allisonf@nccoast.org. If you have a question that's maybe not specifically from me or from one of the presenters tonight, I'm also happy to make sure we get you in contact with them as well and get everybody's questions answered. But while we still have time left, I want to open up the floor for questions and comments. Everybody in this room, I just ask that you proceed to the podium if you have a question. That way, everybody tuning in the virtual world can hear your question as well.
Can you put the very first pictures up of the lake?
Yeah. So one of the progression.
Yeah.
Yep. Um, All right, everybody, tuning in virtually. Just pulling up a map real quick for reference. All right, here we go.
That right there should have told y'all what the problem with the lake is right there. You see this stuff starting on the west side of the lake. On the west side of the causeway. How many canals that drain that lake is on the west side of that highway?
Off the top of my head, I'm not sure.
One.
Okay,
There's 3 on the east side of that. That's why it stayed clear longer. And the problem lies in the canals. You cannot have that lake out there and have it back to what it's supposed to be without cleaning those canals out. And that map right there pretty well answers that question. Tells you where your problem started. It didn't have the canals, remember one canal that flush it. But there's 3 on that east side, and they kept it clean for quite a bit of time. But the other thing is, I've heard a lot here tonight about the canals, about funding and all of that. Has the Fish and Wildlife Service gone to Congress and asked for the appropriation of the money to have these canals cleaned out? And it's mandated to be done every 40 years. All the canals were to be cleaned out. Can anybody tell me if they've ever asked Congress for the money? Because that's the procedure.
Kendall, would you like to speak to that?
All right.
The answer simply is we have not asked for that money. But your account of the way that we're supposed to go about that, or the mandate, is news to me. We've had some solicitors' opinions over the years to gather. I mean, not since in many years past. That question's come up, so I would have to do a little bit of research, but I've heard that, that statement over the years that the refuge or the government was supposed to keep those canals cleaned out as part of the original acquisition. I have never seen it in writing or in legal documents, so that'd be my answer at this point. But I'm not a lawyer.
Have you ever seen it in writing where the farmers have the right to drain?
I have seen that.
It's seen it.
Yes.
There was 5 things. I don't remember what the 5th one was, but it was 4 things. Always got to be some type of hunting out there, or some fishing. Farmers always got a right to drain in, and the canals were to be maintained every 40 years. And that was an agreement with the people of Hyde County and probably the state of North Carolina. And it hasn't been maintained. All of them are past due. And there's been no effort to do it until I've heard more about it tonight about outfall. What did you choose outfall?
Yeah, so originally there were 9 kind of areas that were explored as potential projects. 2 were identified. And then when they were presented to the Board of Commissioners, the feedback was, we'd like to have more information on Outfall Canal specifically. So that's why Outfall Canal was chosen.
Okay, if you go back to the 40 years, Lake Landing was done in 1968. Outfall was done in 1970. It would appear to me that Lake Landing should be done first, if you're going to maintain that 40-year schedule. And then Rose Bay was done in 72 and 74, I believe. And they started on Wapapan in 1976, run out of money, and didn't get the money to finish it until 1980. And then they dug on out in the lake. The drag line started at the refuge line, dug out to where the washout is on the East Main. It sat there for 4 years before they got the money to dig on out to the lake, and then come back to the refuge line and dug all the way out back of my house. So that's why I don't really understand how, outfall come into picture, but except what you're saying.
I would say that barring not having seen the agreement that it's supposed to have been done every 40 years for the purposes of our project thus far, outfall was selected in part because ease of access and, it's a straight shot. There's ease of access on both sides. So it was a good starting point. So having not seen the agreement of federal, federal requirement for the refuge to maintain it 40 years for our purposes, it was the likely selection.
Okay. It hasn't been but 40 some odd years, 42 on Wapop. There's no information just from 42 years ago or so about what was done to get it dug out then. No copies of contracts, what it cost and all those kind of things.
I can speak to that a little bit. Yes, there is records of that. But what happened at that time is that Congress appropriated money. NRCS was involved, to NRCS and Fish and Wildlife Service to obtain easements from those landowners along those canals to do that cleanup work. So Congress appropriated that money at that time. And to address an earlier question, as a federal agency, we cannot ask Congress for money. So that kind of gets to your earlier question, but
I was good friends with Assistant Refuge Manager at that time. He surveyed all the canals with the that showed the depth I had filled in and stuff. And he was the one who told me that they had to get the money from Congress. No. But has anybody been on the canals and checked the bottom lately?
Yeah, so our
I mean,
efforts have
I
been.
want to talk about pollution. This is polluted as you can possibly imagine. And it's not so much from farmers, because most all the drainage ditches on that canal, in Wapop and probably the others too. They have risers into them and control the water level. Holds back a lot of, farm, whatever gets in the ditches and it gradually filters out. It's mostly dead limbs, leaves, trash, natural death of wild animals and things like that. And it stinks so bad you barely can stand and smell it. And if you leave a stick in the water or a crap pot in the water, it turns solid black. Ever how deep it's sitting in that mud. It's nothing more than lack of oxygen. And this has been going on for quite a while. That lake is almost like a commode. If you don't flush it, it's always going to be in bad shape. There's nothing else you can do. You talk about, it's getting harder, maybe kind of sea level rising. The canal, the benefit, but I'm telling you, he can ask probably any farmer in here what happens if he has a ditch or a canal on his property. And at some point, it gets in bad shape. If he can't clean it out, a ditch turns against, a canal will turn against. Cause you problems, and this is what these canals are starting to do. And it's moving more further and further and further out into the sun and creeks there, like at Inglewood and mouth of Lakeland and Outfall. And I haven't been to Rose Bay lately, possibly there too. But that's the thing that I see, and a lot of other people see, that maintaining of these canals is causing a big problem in that lake. The other thing I'd like to address is the park. And I heard about this. I ain't even been out there and looked at it. It's just so unbelievable. That the signs are on it showing that the carp are on the east side of the dams. Did not be putting them over into the lake. Now I have lived here all my life and I have never seen a carp on the east side of those gates, except when the rains get so much that they fill the lake out and the gates open and the water comes out. Then I've seen carp all up and down the sign shoot, all the way to Longshore River and all the way south there out. But you let that water get one little bit salt and they're doing their best to get back in that lake. It's almost like they can't even stand the smell of salt water. They can't even tolerate it at all. The carp aren't coming from the sound, they're coming from the lake. So I can't understand, big deal with the carp.
Can
Trying
I-
to keep carp out of the
can I-
lake, when they're in the lake, they come out.
Wendy,
Can I address, Marcus is making some good points, but I want to state that the technical working group has some amazing fisheries expertise. And what's happening, and Marcos is correct, the carp can't tolerate high salinity water. So the carp are coming in from the saltier brackish water. They're attracted to the freshwater flow coming from those tide gates when the tide gates are open. And of course, we know the tide gates operate by head pressure. When the water on the lakeside is higher, those gates open. So fresh water is coming out through those tide gates. And they're trying to get into the fresh water to breed. They must breed in fresh water. The larvae and the eggs can't tolerate the brackish water. April Lamb and Dr. Jesse Fisher did a mark recapture study. They were with NC State, and this was about a year and a half ago. And they estimated at that time about 4.4 million pounds of carp in the lake. So it's a very dense population of invasive common carp. And it's basically their feeding behavior. They're bottom feeders. They're stirring up the sediments looking for small invertebrates and insects, and that redistributes all of those sediments and total suspended solids back into the water column, which further blocks sunlight penetration that SAV needs to be able to photosynthesize.
So you're saying
thank
that
you, Wendy.
carp can possibly survive on the east side of those gates during
sir.
very, very salty water times, it's salty all the way up to the dam, they can't do it.
They can tolerate, the adults can tolerate saltier water, but the younger carp and the smaller carp cannot tolerate it all. They must breed in fresh water. They cannot breed in brackish or salty water.
What I've seen is when it gets real salty, right on up to the dams, the carp are dead.
That's
I don't-
correct. That's correct. The common carp threshold is 14 parts per thousand. So what you saw were the carp coming up into that gate, trying to get back into the lake, as you said.
And they come out,
Well, it may have come back and out of the lake. The timing of that being in front there was good timing, because now they can't get back in the lake. So it may be that they don't come from the sound, but we also have on the west side too, with the Pumbaa River, that population could feed in that way. So the gates are there to at least keep what's in the lake, and not have that back and forth grouping. But you're right that when they're coming back through in a freshwater and freshet, the Pamlico Sound could have some carp that been moving from the lake and using the canal as well. As you said, if they move out with fresh water. But as Wendy says, we're just trying to keep them inside the lake there.
so that's what the gates are for. Where y'all trying to block them.
We're trying to block them any more back and forth on all gates to keep that consistent. But you're right that they can only survive in certain salinities. And by the way, my name is Kevin Dockman, working with Wildlife Commission as fish biologist, the technical group, but great points that you bring. We're trying to get that, so
Another good question for you. How many carp have you got to get out of that lake?
So the ecological threshold is 25 pounds per acre. If we can keep it below 25 pounds per acre, we're in a better balanced situation. Right now, we're at about 100 pounds per acre, so we're 3 times the amount that is actually able to allow for better SAV survival.
What I've been told and read is that unless you get rid of all the carp, you're never going to solve the problem.
So I've been sampling on the lake since 2003, and the carp have been out there. So we did see grass in the window that there's, when carp are out there, SAB grass can be out there. It's just an ecological threshold that they're above right now that's creating that.
I can remember back as young as probably 4 or 5 years old. Tons of park. They used to, when the wind would blow to the north side of the lake, the park would go over and the people would draw. When it pushed the water over in the.
I think it's a great conversation to have about that history, but just to answer your question about the threshold is.
But you do think you can get them under control?
Well, that's our goal, is to get that biomass.
I'll tell you, that's a good way.
And-
Commercial fishermen, $10 a fish, and we get rid of everything.
And I do want to be respectful of everybody's time. The meeting technically ends at 8:30, so I would like to open up briefly. If anybody else has any other questions, I'd like to give somebody the opportunity, and if not, we can definitely carry on the conversation.
Thank you.
Just like to thank everybody for all of what y'all have done and all of your hard work, but thank you very much for that. And is there an email list, a notification of this that I could get on some way?
Yes,
That's
so.
the main thing I want.
Yeah, thank you, first of all. And there is, so if you go to the North Carolina Coastal Federation's website, that nccoast.org/Lake Mattamuskeet, there is an area where you can register your email to stay up to date on the current happenings and newsletter that's sent out. And then also on that same page is where all the recordings from past public meetings are, and this one as well.
And will there be notifications for the next public meeting?
Yes.
back from
Yep.
there? Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. Does anybody else have any comments or questions while we? Yeah.
For the benefit of the people that haven't been in the stakeholders meeting, Alessa, could you, in Hyde County, when you say salt, it's like screaming fire. So could you talk about how those samples were composited, were brought together for one salinity, and how you're trying to separate that out so we can actually figure out how to manage that dredge that's coming, the spoil that's coming out of the canal beds?
Sure,
Thank
yes.
you.
So we did collect sediment cores at 3 locations along the canal, one closer to the lake, one kind of in the middle, receiving agricultural inputs, and then one towards the sound. All of those were sample or analyzed individually for different contaminants, but we ended up compositing them to do the agronomic analysis, which is where we received salt, the salt content results. We are next week going out and collecting new samples and analyzing each of those separately so that we can see the distribution of salt content along the canal and whether it's focused closer to the sound, and maybe we can kind of like isolate that material to be managed differently from other areas along the canal. So we're exploring that more, and we'll have hopefully answers by the next stakeholder meeting, certainly the next public meeting. Yeah.
You don't heard this before. I'll make this quick, and I'm Larry Boomer. And on these canals, everything Mark could have said was pretty accurate, very accurate. But why are we reinventing the wheel? All these canals have been done before. This isn't something brand new. This doesn't take study. This doesn't take $1 million study to figure out. We just need to do the canal right. And every time they've been dug out, you dig the dirt out in the canal and put it on the bank. And there's a flow area on every one of these canals. We're not talking about going to the end of the outfall canal and throwing dirt on top of needle rush. But on one side, there's a road all the way to the end. So all the spoil could go there. And once you get up to the tree line, you can put the spoil on both sides. And the same thing with at least some of Rose Bay, all of Wypop and all of Lake Landing. So a friend of mine owns a development down there, and there's a deeded, and I'm not sure the term here, but there's a deeded right of way. When they deed the canal out, Lake Landing Canal, the dirt is going to go beside that canal. Nobody can stop it. Nobody can do anything about it. It's part of it. It's on all the deeds. So I've been told. So anyway, why are we reinventing the wheel? I guess that goes to you.
Oh, I'll just tune in real quick. So just to kind of answer your question about why we're spending money to look at these things is a big part of it is that in order to get funding for any sort of large project, we do have to have concrete studies and data showing why we're asking for funding. So part of the benefit for doing these is so that we can get the funding to secure and have a construction project ready to go on the ground. It does take time, so.
But the study is one thing, we're putting 6-inch material, 400 from the bank on that head. That's not on that money. Project that could be done just like it was done before. You get out, you don't break it.
Yes,
And once you get out of the marsh area, you don't put it on both sides. I mean, it's the area is already there.
so I don't know if Alyssa, you want to speak to the sediment analysis, but I'll briefly just say that part of the study is to know where we can put the material and what's in the soil so that we're not,
Don't put that on field, it does. I'll go on. You got the rocks on top of it, on top. I mean, what doesn't matter if it's 50%.
So, I mean, part of it, this is just it's a very large project, so there's regulations that have to be followed and permit requirements and things like that. And so, you know, certainly the material, I guess I wasn't around when it was done in the 70s, but it's still, it's a more complex project in that,
But couldn't we save millions of dollars on this project by not having to put?
We do.
Oh,
so we did consider, you know, short haul and longer haul applications where short haul is, you know, along the canal within 3 miles.
If I could say, the 6 inches over 400 acres was just to give a perspective of how much sediment there was.
Yes.
That's
and that
not what
was-
the proposal is
Right,
to
right.
place all that.
The big proposal before you got involved. Well, so you did the canal, we're gonna put it all.
So that was included in part of looking at. Certainly, you know, placement of spoil beside the canal is obviously the most cost effective. But, you know, Marco gave a lot of examples of when these canals were cleaned out. And a lot also has changed on the ground and regulatory changes since those dates that he listed as well. So it's not as simple to do now as it was then. It's only getting more complex. So yeah, certainly direct placement beside the canal is, you know, the most effective. There's a lot of other considerations as well. So for instance, Outfall Canal, you're proposing that we dump all the sediment on top of the DOT maintained highway, and then they're going to come back and put rock on top of it.
What most people do, what we did on the refuge, when I worked there, is we poured the road, we dug the rock out, put it on the side, put the spoil in there, it right out to the other, put the rock back on it, and put all it there. That's what we did. When I was in.
So that would be a good management. I mean, that sounds like a good management strategy, better than hauling sediment 20 miles, but it's still not as simple as just placing it on top of the road.
so we are a little bit past our meeting time. I do want to be respectful of everybody's evening and thank you all very much for taking the time on your weeknight to join us. And hopefully on your drive home, it's not too windy or rainy for you. I've been hearing it during our meeting. But thank you again for joining us tonight. Like I said, a lot of information, including this presentation, can be found on our website, but I also invite all of you to reach out to me directly to continue the conversation or on your drive home in the rain. If you think of another question, don't hesitate to reach out. And if I can't answer it, I'll be sure to get you in touch with somebody that can. So thank you all very much. And sorry to the virtual world, but everybody here, if you haven't grabbed a cookie or a snack, grab one on your way out and enjoy. Thank you.